Online. This is the What's New in AP Stylebook session. This is a session that's for years been very popular at the in-person conference. Many of our ACES members use AP Style, and they're always eager to hear what's about to be announced in the AP Stylebook. And the AP Stylebook editors for years now have been gracious enough to come to our conferences and tell everybody in person, possibly making historical announcements. And you'll see if the same holds true today. Some announcements before we go on. You can follow online on Twitter with the handle hashtag ACES2020 online. We will be taking questions during the webinar. We have our Executive Director, Abby Booth, assisting with the questions and relaying them to our presenters. There are 1,000 of you here, so we'll try to get to as many of you as we can. And we are on a tight schedule. So please use the Q&A and chat boxes for the questions. If we run out of time and don't get to your question, please feel free to reach out to us via email at info@aceseditors.org. And our presenters will be giving out information where you could reach them too. So let me introduce you to our presenters this afternoon, or still this morning in the Pacific time zone. Paula Froke is the editor of the Associated Press Stylebook. She started her more than 30 years with the AP as a Dow Jones News Fund intern on the AP's main editing desk in New York. Her AP career has included jobs as news editor in Minnesota and Michigan, deputy national editor at the AP headquarters, assistant managing editor for Nights on the Nerve Center, the AP embedded editor at SMN News, and the executive director of the Associated Press Media Editors. Now, a minor part of her pedigree, former longtime Stylebook editor Norm Goldstein, who's presented at many ACES conferences, was one of her father's journalism students at Penn State. So this is like AP style royalty. We also have Colleen Newvine. She's the product manager for the Associated Press Stylebook. She was a reporter and editor at daily, weekly, and monthly publications before getting her MBA and moving to the business side of news. She joined the AP in 2006 and has worked on the Stylebook nearly that long. She was inducted into the Central Michigan University Journalism Hall of Fame in 2017, recognizing her work on the Stylebook. She is also a marketing consultant and coach, and she blogs on living life intentionally. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Paula and Colleen. Thank you for being here, you guys.
Thank you so much, Neil, and thank you to everyone for having us here. We're delighted to be able to speak to you even from this remote distance. Just a quick word on the order of events. I'll turn it over to Colleen in a minute and then go through the entire presentation and take questions at the end. So if we could handle it that way, I think it would be easiest. Colleen?
Yeah, hi everyone. I wish that I could see all of you, but I'm glad we can join you in some form. We've been coming to ACES for years and doing this session that we often describe as being sort of a sneak peek of what's in that year's Stylebook. So before Paula jumps into telling you what will be in the book that's at the printer right now, we have some news about the frequency of the book itself. Starting this year, we won't produce a new book each spring, and instead we'll print a new Stylebook every other year. So every year when we talk with you at ACES, we talk about how language is always evolving and changing, and we add new entries or edit existing ones in response to the news or changes in common usage. And for decades, we've printed a new book every year to keep up with that evolution. But in recent years, print sales have decreased as AP Stylebook Online subscriptions have grown. And most people don't buy a new spiral-bound Stylebook every year. They use it for a few years before they replace it. So we think that we can serve our loyal print fans by printing the spiral-bound every other year, while AP Style fans who want to keep pace with changes as we make them can subscribe to AP Stylebook Online. And speaking of AP Stylebook Online, the changes that Paula is going to talk about will appear there today. So keep an eye out. If you're a subscriber, you should be getting a very big, long email very soon.
All right. So I wanted to introduce the rest of the members of the team. In addition to me, we have three of these are longtime Stylebook team members and two are new. Jerry Schwartz has been with us for a very long time. He's an editor at large with the AP, usually based in New York, at the moment based in somewhere in New Jersey. Anna Jo Bratton is the deputy director for news gathering in our West region. She also has been with the Stylebook for a number of years. New this year is Raghu Vadarevu. Raghu is news editor for digital storytelling for our global investigative team, and he is based in Phoenix. Pia Sarkar is also new this year. She is a news editor on our business news team, usually in New York, although she usually also works out of Philly as well. And Jeff McMillan, who is an editor on our East Desk. Jeff has been with the Stylebook for a number of years also. As always, we also work with our comrades throughout the AP, the subject matter experts, and they in turn, as do we, often reach out to organizations and experts in a variety of fields all over the world to help develop the guidance. And as you will see throughout the presentation, we get a lot of advice from our social media fans on Twitter and Facebook and elsewhere. We get questions from users through Stylebook Online's Ask the Editor or our public suggestions link. We get emails from members of the public. So ideas come from a lot of places. I wanted to take a moment to note that this year's book is in the memory of Anik Justanen, known as Nick, who over the years has been a key contributor to the Stylebook and in fact had been working with me up until early March, until he passed away from COVID in mid-March. Nick had been a very healthy person. This shows him on one of his runs. He had run, I think, 84 marathons on every continent. And he was dearly beloved in the AP, so we dedicate this to Nick. A couple of sort of housekeeping notes before I get into the bulk of it. We, for a number of years, have had separate chapters on food and fashion, one on each, food and fashion. But as we have continued to add more content over the years and added chapters, including the ones on data journalism, polls and surveys, and health and science, I think everyone is aware of how big the book has gotten. Massive. So something had to give. And in addition, AP no longer has people dedicated to coverage of food or fashion, so we don't have that expertise at our fingertips. So we have taken those, food and fashion are no longer separate chapters. Instead, most of the entries have gone to online only. So if you want to search for something, you still can do that. It just won't be in the print book. A few entries from each of those chapters is now in the main A to Z section, but most of it is online only and not in a separate chapter. We also, in an attempt to cut space or cut the content to a more manageable level and I think bring some more intelligence to what's in the book, have moved many of what I lovingly term the random spelling words to online only. There have been a lot of words interspersed that clearly came about over the course of decades because a certain editor felt a need to put it there. My favorite, of course, has always been bicycle for a long time, was this random spelling word in the book. But that's why we have dictionaries, and they were just taking up space. So we have moved most of those online as well. Some of them, such as bicycle, I believe I just cut all together. And finally, as many of you know, we had talked last year about the hope to revise our numerals policy. So the breaking news right now is we have not done that. We continue to try to do that. We had an hour-long session at ACES last year in which we tried to get help in formulating a coherent guidance, and that resulted in simply more confusion. Obviously, this is going to take a lot of time and thought, and this was not the year to do it, even before the world erupted. So I'm actually quite glad that we didn't do it. But stay tuned to that. Stay tuned for that sometime in the future. So as you know, we update throughout the year. Most of what I will tell you about today is brand new, but let's get to a couple of recent highlights first that have already been online. Most of you know, I believe, that we've already done a AP topical guide online on coronaviruses and COVID-19. We have updated that a number of times and will continue to do so. The book will feature a separate entry on coronaviruses and COVID-19, but I'm not going to get into those here because we have limited time. The same with education-related terms. We had a topical guide on those, and we have a number of new terms related to education that we released, I think, in August or so. Again, I'm not going to get into them there. If anyone has any questions, get back to me or ask at the end. Whoops. Sorry, guys. I was going to, before I got lost in my notes, set that up by saying that this next one is jarring, and the placement of it could be jarring, but there's no good place to put it. We got a good question from a user pointing out that often this term is used incorrectly, such as a pedophilia conviction. So we did do an entry clarifying that it's not a legal term, and so therefore don't use it that way, and instead spell out the actual terms, the actual charges, such as a convicted sexual offender, not a convicted pedophile, for example. This one is a change that is about something that we took out rather than something we put in. It shows our preferred spelling for the past tense, pleaded, and form, pleaded. That's always been the case, but for years up until now, the entry added the admonition, do not use the colloquial past tense form pled. So one day we tweeted that guidance and Twitter erupted. That's just a small sample. Now, it's true that our friends on Twitter get annoyed with us for many reasons, and many times we appreciate their sentiments and we say, thank you very much, but we're going to stay where we are. Other times, though, what the response causes us to do more research and more thinking. And in fact, the current team, and I think the one before me and the one before that, hadn't talked about it at all. It just hadn't been on a radar while we dealt with other things. But what happened here caused us to take another look at it and take a look at usage and take a look at the arguments and say, yeah, you know, you're right. Our preferred style remains pleaded, as does the preferred style for Webster's New World and Merriam-Webster. But we just took away that school marmish admonition not to use pled. If you want to use pled, that's fine. We don't care. It's an example of how some of the feedback we get on Twitter can often lead us into new directions of thinking. They don't get to choose the prom queen or king, but our fans often do cause us to rethink some things. The same was the case with midnight. Previously, our entry had said that midnight is part of the day that is ending, not the one that is beginning. But that resulted in some more great disagreement. And the key thing here is that it revealed a great deal of misunderstanding or lack of agreement among the world about exactly what midnight does mean. This particular unofficial poll pretty much reflected what we found, that there was a very, very big split. Some people thought it was the end of the previous day. Some people thought it was the start of the new day. And in fact, Webster's New World College Dictionary, one of its definitions calls it the middle of the night, which is ambiguous at best. So we revised our guidance to say, just avoid using the term. It's confusing. People don't necessarily know what you mean. Instead, use 11:59 p.m. Thursday or 12:01 a.m. Friday. Another one that we got great feedback from our Twitter users on, and this again was one that had not really been on our radar, the original version that said call it a canning jar, not a mason jar. It was done a decade or so ago by our then food writer. It just hadn't risen to the level that we gave it any thought, as we did many other things, until we tweeted it and got a great deal of constructive response. So now we say, yeah, everyone calls it a mason jar, call it a mason jar, and if you want, you can also call it a canning jar. Okay, so some changes that are taking place today, that are taking effect today, and I'm about to say a lot of words about a lot of these, so hang in there. Last year, as many of you know, we added guidance on sexual harassment and sexual misconduct. No, I'm sorry, that was 2 years ago we did that. And that guidance has served us well. But a certain Neil Holdway, who many of you know from ACES fame, separately asked us for some guidance on some issues related to juveniles in particular. And that led us to realize that for whatever reasons over the years, the Stylebook had never done an entry or extended guidance on sexual abuse or sexual assault. So we addressed that in the past year with a lot of help from some AP reporters and editors who cover these topics a lot, and then some outside groups as well. We start out with kind of a discussion about it, saying basically proceed with care, because like midnight, there can be a lot of different understandings of what each of these terms use. So don't just automatically repeat what someone who is accusing someone is saying, or what even an authority is saying. Press for details on what is meant. It is also very important to pay close attention to the precise legal definitions, and this is complicated by the fact that those vary by jurisdiction. Also pay attention to the wording of the criminal charges or convictions, and consider the nuance of each situation and what might be conveyed or perceived by the language used. And then, as we've said in the past, make sure that the allegations are well documented and corroborated, and seek comment from people involved. We go on to say, we generally do not identify in text or images those who say they've been sexually assaulted or subjected to extreme abuse. We may identify victims of sexual assault or extreme abuse if they publicly identify themselves. We make these decisions on a case-by-case basis, and it depends in part on the nature of the allegations. Again, these various terms have legal definitions, and again, we can't give those definitions in the Stylebook because they vary by jurisdiction. So we're trying to make the point here that it's very important that people covering any individual case either be very familiar from the outset or quickly become familiar with what those legal definitions are in each in their jurisdiction. We note at the end that, and at the end of the slide, it might be appropriate to explain why a story does or doesn't use certain terms. For instance, the woman said she was raped, and prosecutors charged the man with sexual assault under the definition in state law. So the point here is that in very many cases, a lot more reporting is involved, and seeking to understand what some of these complicated issues are, and just don't automatically parrot what people are saying. Again, a key element in many cases is the element of consent, and definitions of that also can vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. From there, we segue more into the existing sexual harassment and sexual misconduct material that we had previously put in the Stylebook. A new point that developed, we've said, just to recap for those of you who might not be familiar, our previous guidance had stressed that in general, when you're talking about sexual misconduct or harassment and not abuse or assault, that our preferred term is sexual misconduct because it encompasses a broader range of misbehavior. But new this year, our reporters who cover this noted that we should specifically say to use the term sexual harassment if it's a specific legal charge or a formal complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And then also new is the suggestion that the term sexual violence might be used in broad references, but again, we much prefer the specific wording. This is longstanding guidance. Don't talk about a person being a victim unless the accused person has been convicted, but at the same time, we absolutely hate, actually, the term alleged victim. Our preference is the term accuser in these cases. If you need to use a term like that, I know that there are some who push for not using that term either, but this is one of those cases where there are not a lot of except great alternatives. And we'd rather simply say the woman, or if it's a man, the man. in favor of a word like accuser, and certainly not alleged victim. All right, this is another new entry, a rather long entry. This one had been on our to-do list for several years, and it got complicated because it's an easy thing to do in principle, but when it gets down to the actual specifics, it often can get very complicated. In fact, I tried to do it last year in last year's book, and just had to table it because there was so much more research and thinking that had to be done. So we start with an introduction that say basically that it is complicated. In general, use terms that can apply to any gender, to treat people equally and be inclusive of people whose gender identity isn't strictly male or female. But we go on to say, sorry, I'm having trouble reading this because this Zoom is at the slide. As at the side, balance these aims with common sense, respect for the language, and an understanding that gender neutral or gender inclusive language is evolving and in some cases is challenging to achieve, as we will see in some of these examples. Some of these are the easier ones. The key point here is to give it thought, okay? In some cases, there just won't be a good answer, but we wanted to make the point that people should stop and think about these words when they see a term such as manhunt or doorman. We like chair, even though I know that there are some arguments that a person cannot be a chair, but I think that's relatively long time accepted use, or chairperson, council member, spokesperson. Most of those are fairly well ensconced in the language these days. Council member as one word is something I personally can't stand, but it's used officially in some jurisdictions, so we say that's acceptable. On the other hand, terms like mother, father, son and daughter, husband, wife, etc., are generally acceptable. That's one of those areas that we don't particularly want to get into upending the language. But if an individual specifies that they want to use the term parent instead of mother or father, child or sibling, then that's perfectly fine too. Fiancé and divorcee, which are generally terms we avoid anyway, but the male-female forms we, after some discussion, decided to accept as well. At the same time, we say to avoid tortured constructions, such as, oh, for instance, snow person, Frosty the snow person, base person instead of base man, which I'll get to in a minute, or fresh person. On the other hand, we say that congressmen and congresswomen are acceptable because of their common use, particularly in Washington, and that's a tide that we can't really fight at this time. If Congress members want to start calling themselves congresspersons or congresspeople, then we might look at that. But for now, that's again one of those situations that we thought it is what it is, and we're doing the best we can. Sports is another big one. We had a lot of discussion with our sports colleagues, and I did a survey of the lay of the land, and simply nobody is using. I think I found one instance of a third base woman, for example. It's just not handy. Handy isn't the right word, but it just didn't make sense in the sports context. To do that. So we suggest rephrasing as possible. Instead of calling her third baseman Colleen Newvine, say she plays third base. And very well, I might add. Again, princess, duchess, and lady in a royal context are not going to go away anytime soon. Goddess in a religious context. But Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love. There are the 7 founding fathers, and Frosty the Snowman is indeed the character's name. But, if you want to call him Frosty, that works too. Similarly, we made a change to in the religious references entry, the subsection on deities used to refer to in using capitalized or lowercase. We said to use lowercase for he and him. Now we say to simply avoid the use of pronouns outside of direct quotes. Mistress. You can excuse me for just a second here. This one has had a long history on the style team as well. Maybe 5 or so years ago, after a lot of research and effort, the then team came up with a fairly complicated definition of what a mistress is and when it was appropriate or not appropriate to use that term. Even at that time, when it got into the book, there was a lot of discomfort with it, but it was necessary in some situations. It was felt at the time. I think it's safe to say that no one has ever been comfortable with it, either then or since then. And after some more discussion, we went further this year with a new entry, or revised entry, that says do not use it, this archaic and sexist term. Instead, use alternative like companion, friend, or lover. The problem with that shorthand, obviously, is that companion, friend, or lover in many cases doesn't really capture the situation, but we felt it was better to be vague like that than use the term mistress, particularly since there's no real equivalent for a male. Gigolo just doesn't really work for that. But so we say, okay, use the most appropriate other term that you can find, and then be sure to provide additional details later. Climate change. The first thing to note here is a change in the emphasis. The previous guidance had congregated under the heading global warming, because that was the term most commonly used by folks out there in the world, and climate change had simply referred to the global warming entry. This year we are changing the name of the entry to climate change. Previously also the entry began this way: the terms global warming and climate change can be used interchangeably. We went on to say climate change is more accurate scientifically, but global warming as a term is more common and understandable to the public. So the new entry tweaks that wording. We now say the terms global warming and climate change are often used interchangeably, and that climate change is more accurate. We go on to note that global warming is one aspect of climate change. And we also note that the terms climate crisis and climate emergency are used by some scientists, policymakers, and others, and are acceptable. You will note that we don't go out of our way to make a point to recommend uses of those words, unlike some other organizations. It's an ongoing discussion. So we kind of tried to fall in the middle a little bit to say, yeah, it's okay to use. The concern there is that it has a ring of advocacy that might not work in many writing situations. So we still prefer the term climate change, unless you're talking specifically about that sub-aspect, global warming. But we kind of open the door to climate crisis and climate emergency at this time. We also expanded the entry to give some more coverage guidelines, including avoiding attributing single occurrences to climate change unless there is a definite connection that scientists have developed. And at the same time, stories about individual events should make clear that they occur in a larger context. And we give an example of what such phrasing might involve. This is another addition to the entry, which you can read. This part is something of a change. Previously, we had said to describe those who don't accept climate science or dispute that the world is warming, use climate change doubters. We recommended the term climate change doubters, or those who reject mainstream climate science. We said not to use skeptics or deniers. Now we say don't use any of those terms, including climate change doubters, and instead be specific about a group, about an individual's belief or a group of people's beliefs. And the reason is those terms are just too broad. People who object or don't believe in various aspects of it have different points that they might object to. And so using the broad brush term is basically inaccurate. You certainly need more words when you're talking about the specifics, but as in many things in the style book and our coverage guidance, we say specifics are better and don't try and take a shortcut, because that just leads to inaccuracy. The entry goes on to also give a little bit of background on the detail of climate change science. This is another new entry that results from discussions that began with the American Geriatric Society, which had worked with other groups and organizations on research that finding that many people associate the terms elderly or senior citizen with a lot of negative stereotypes. They also pointed us to new guidance from the American Psychological Society, which is in line with what I'm about to show you. So this new entry says that the term older adults or older person, older people is preferred over senior citizens, seniors, or elderly. It's a general term when appropriate and relevant, and in many cases it's not. Best used in general phrases that do not refer to specific individuals, such as you see here, but then aim for specificity when possible. We note that definitions and understandings vary about the age range denoted by the term older adult, but that's also true of the term senior citizen, senior, and elderly. And we note that increasingly those terms, the term older adult and older person outside of the AP are being increasingly used and seemed the right way to go. And then again, obviously make clear in the context what you're talking about. Just look at some examples there. The third paragraph here, we did reluctantly decide that the term elderly is okay in headlines, again, when relevant, if necessary because of space constraints. But in many cases, people automatically use that term when there's plenty of room for more specificity, such as woman 89 rather than elderly woman. In keeping with our general philosophy of trying to let people be called what they want to be called, if a person says, I prefer to be called a senior citizen or elderly, that's fine. But we say, do not use the elderly in reference to a group, as we say in some other situations as well. Disabilities. First off, this is a change in the entry name. It had been called disabled, handicapped. The handicapped was a problem since the entry says don't use the term handicapped. And the entry's name simply never been changed over the years. And disabilities in general seemed a better entry name. But here again, we say ask people if it's possible how they prefer to be described. There are some strong feelings among some that they wish to be called a disabled person rather than a person with a disability. So try and determine the person's preference. Describing groups of people, use the person first language, people with disabilities. Along also the same lines, some minor changes to two separate entries, one on addiction and the other called alcoholic. We had 2 years ago said avoid the terms alcoholic, addict, user, and abuser altogether. And that was based on advice from a number of government and scientific organizations who said that it was just, it perpetrated the stigma, even including in the person's own mind. We heard a lot from people who said, I'm an alcoholic and I know I'm an alcoholic and I want you to call me an alcoholic or an addict or a user or an abuser. So we changed that wording to say if the individual prefers those terms for themselves, then it's fine to use. But we still say don't use junkie, drunk, crackhead, or anything else along those lines. A change in the weapons entry. Our previous entry, which contains a lot of information, I'm just giving you one section of it, recommended the terms assault rifle or assault weapon, and noted that those terms are also often used interchangeably. We also noted some technical differences between what was called an assault rifle and an assault weapon. We have updated that to now say the preferred term for these types of weapons is semi-automatic rifle, okay? Not assault rifle, not assault weapon, but a semi-automatic rifle. That term doesn't get into the details of the rifle's appearance, but our belief that's not integral to its function, and the term semi-automatic rifle is just a better term overall, in part because assault rifle and assault weapon are both highly politicized terms that get bandied about. And as with other points, don't just automatically repeat the terms used by others, including witnesses who often are not reliable witnesses in this regard. Get specifics from authorities. All right, misinformation, fact checks, and fake news. This is an expansion of an entry we did, I believe, last year, which at the time was simply fact checks and fake news. We've broadened that as the misinformation situation in the world has evolved to give a broader the broader use of the term misinformation, which refers to false information shared about a particular topic that could be mistaken as truth. It can include honest mistakes, which is an important thing to note, exaggerations and misunderstandings of fact, as well as disinformation, which refers to misinformation created and spread intentionally to mislead or confuse. We say when used broadly, the term misinformation is preferable to the term fake news, but it's okay to use fake news in quotes or as a shorthand for the deliberate falsehoods or fiction masked as news. That part was in the entry last year. And in any case, again, be specific and also avoid amplifying the false claim. Something of a housekeeping note, no real changes here, but our previous gender entry had been just focused on gender-related terminology. Other terms related to sexuality were scattered throughout the book. We thought it made more sense to just bring those all under one bigger umbrella. So now the entry is titled Gender and Sexuality. I don't think if we made any changes to any of the individual entries contained there, they were not major. This is just, like I said, a housekeeping note. This is a new entry, which resulted from, I'm trying to remember, 2 separate requests. One came from a city official, and I believe in our Stylebook Online's suggestions link, and another came from a woman who was leading a high school journalism conference by Ask the Editor, just for some guidance in covering homeless people and homelessness. So we talked to some organizations and experts and devised this guidance, including do not use the collective noun the homeless, just like we don't use the elderly or the disabled. This third paragraph here is key. Mention that the person is homeless only when relevant. We saw a lot of uses that someone is just kind of described as homeless even when it had no bearing whatsoever on the situation at hand. Again, that's along the lines of our guidance on, for instance, disabilities or ages of people, that the information, if it's not relevant, don't use it. And do not use these stereotypes or imply the stereotypes. We note that many homeless people hold jobs and are self-sufficient. They just do not have a regular home. Homeless shelter is acceptable. It probably, I tried to argue to the team that to say do not use Flophouse went without saying, and we didn't need to do that. And they pushed back and said, no, they'd actually seen that use more often than we should. So don't use the term Flophouse. When we tried to provide a specific definition for what homelessness entailed, we found that government agencies don't always agree. But generally speaking, it refers to people staying in shelters or on the street. And again, avoid this disparaging terminology. And again, some more definitions. This voodoo question and entry has been evolving for a number of years in the world of the style book. For years, and going to have to read my notes here. We had said voodoo, VOODOO, capitalized when referring specifically to the religion practiced primarily in Haiti and parts of Africa, lowercase in other uses, especially when ascribing magical solutions to problems such as voodoo economics. 3 years ago, based on a suggestion from our correspondent in Haiti, we added to that it should note in a story that the religion is known in Haiti as voodoo, VODOU. There's no agreement on pronunciation of that I could find. So we added an acknowledgement 3 years ago of the common use in Haiti of the spelling VODOU, but we still went primarily with the other version. But then we heard from a number of voodoo practitioners, as well as our own staff in the region, that we needed to sharpen the entry in an effort to be respectful of those who practice it, and recognizing the very strong sentiment of the pejorative use of the term voodoo. It got complicated by the fact that in Louisiana, the VOODOO is commonly used and is totally acceptable when referring to the religion. It was further complicated by the fact that there are still more variations on the spelling, but it was believed by the people that we talked to that it wasn't necessary to get into those. But we did then go a step further and say to avoid using either term as a shorthand for magical or superstitious beliefs. Previously, we had said that it was okay, but the current team looked at it and thought, how can that possibly be okay? Y'all can think of any of a number of other terms that simply don't work in a general use. We recognize that, in doing research, I saw a couple of stories in which the authorities talked about someone doing something as part of a voodoo ritual. So sometimes it's not totally avoidable, but limit the use. Don't use it on your own, we say, and explain what is meant. And if you do need to use it, do it only in a direct quote. This next one came about because of some questions and requests on Ask the Editor and Twitter, a lot of them actually. So we are now allowing the use of the plus symbol in terms such as when it's the formal name, when it's pronounced, and that's key, pronounced as part of the company brand or event name, Disney Plus, Apple TV Plus, ESPN Plus, etc. Spell out the word plus in other uses. A lot of thought went into this and a lot of discussion with our technology folks and some other people. One issue was some of these brands, and I don't have the example in front of me, but one of the ones that I got specifically asked about that used the plus symbol, there really was no logical way to spell it out. A bigger issue was that if you think in terms of the regular readers, we end up just looking wrong to spell out the plus in Disney Plus or the plus in Apple TV Plus. I mean, regular readers, regular folks see it all the time with the plus symbol. So when a news organization or anyone else feels compelled to spell it out because AP Style told them to, our belief was it basically just looks wrong to people. On the other hand, no, to answer your questions that I'm sure we will get, this is not intended to open the door to allowing any of a number of other bizarre punctuation elements in entry names or in other names. Okay, one more, I think. Previously, we had said to avoid using the term preheat, and we said instead heat the oven to 350 degrees, for example. We tweeted that around Thanksgiving last year, and this is what happened. And on and on and on and on and on. The point here is not the extent of the pushback that we got, but rather the logic of what a lot of these folks were saying. It's true, people pointed out that their ovens said preheat on it. Cookbooks say preheat. Everyone talks about preheat. the person who a number of years ago argued not to use preheat was quite correct in thinking that it's redundant. It's extremely redundant, but it's also extremely much used. And that's what's understood by regular people, regular readers. And there are arguments that if we simply say heat the oven, people wouldn't get where, necessarily wouldn't understand where in the process to do that. So we ended up agreeing with all of this, again, not because of the rather massive amount of pushback that we got, but because these people, we decided were absolutely right. Everyone on the team said, yeah, we don't like that it's redundant, but we agree that it's silly not to allow it. Oops, look, there's more. There's still more. I lost track of how much we had here. So now we say preheat is acceptable to refer to heating the oven to a specific temperature. So on that note, I will turn it over. That's the end of the rundown of most of the major new material this year. We will have a bit more at the end of the month when we launch the book for the next 2 years. But I will turn it over to Colleen for a little bit before coming back to me for some questions.
Oh, hang on just one sec. Please. How about that? Is that echoey? Okay.
That's good.
Great. So now that Paula has preheated my slide for me, this is the instructions on how you can get an ACES member discount on AP Stylebook Online. So if you'd like to log in and search for all of these entries because you couldn't possibly keep up with the Twitter traffic and the chat traffic and the slides all at once, you can go to apstylebook.com/ACES, and it will give you the instructions on how you claim your 20% discount on AP Stylebook Online. That also applies to a version of our subscription service, which includes our primary dictionary, Webster's New World Online. So if you'd like to do a single search and come up with all of the AP style entries, plus any random spelling entries, it includes all of the massive resource of our primary dictionary. So if you could hit the next slide.
Can you hear? You can hear me, right?
Yep.
I need to jump in here for just a moment because I'm quite sure that the sharp-eyed people among you will note that I think we probably used an old version of this that neither of us caught. Yes, we use the % symbol now. Yeah.
That's my fault. So there you go.
And it's my fault because I didn't get to the slide to review. But there you go. Welcome to our lives. It's been a busy time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, % is now a % sign if you missed that last year.
Is this your correct? Yeah, this is your correct new slide?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that's just showing a close-up of apstylebook.com/ACES, where you can go to hopefully see it with a % sign as soon as we get off this call. And then if you get off of that embarrassing thing, then we've heard from a lot of AP Stylebook users that they left their physical book on their desk or back on campus, and now they find themselves at home. We're offering free trials of AP Stylebook Online. So if you need that little bridge to keep you in AP Style until you can get reunited with your physical book, you can go to our website. It's apstylebook.com/free trial and choose ACES from the drop-down menu, and we'll set you up with a free trial. And again, you'll be able to see everything that's gone live today.
And that concludes our formal presentation, and we would be delighted to answer questions.
Well, Paula, I was following along with the chat while you were talking, and I think the two most lively points of conversation were brainstorming what the best gender-neutral version of fisherman should be. I don't know if you have any thoughts off the top of your head.
You know, I could be remembering this wrong. I think Webster's New World has fisher as an entry? Because I think we got a question on that from Ask the Editor, and someone said something like Webster's New World allows Fisher. Can this possibly be right? And I looked it up. Again, this is my recollection, and indeed that was true, which obviously sounds odd. So no, I should have noted in the gender neutral discussion that we do have a list in the entry that I didn't include on the slides of a number of recommended terms. But it was not all inclusive, for one thing, because it can't be all inclusive. Have I mentioned the book is too long already? And there hadn't been a great resolution for some of them. I don't recall that Fisher person came up. So no, I think my recommendation would be just to try and write around it, just as you do for third baseman. Say she plays third base, say he likes to fish. Yeah, and again, people want to have absolute answers, and as we made the point, sometimes it's just hard to achieve. But think about it, and if you can't come up with anything other than fisherman or Fisher, just go into it knowing that you've given it your best effort and really give it
on. And then there was also a spirited discussion in the chat about possible alternatives for a gender-neutral version of mistress, including advocacy for manstress and paramour. So just know that you kicked off a lot of word nerd brainstorming while you were
about manstress before.
We had a question about the gender-neutral terms and just whether they will be all collected under one header or if they'll be dispersed throughout the book.
So the ones that we have recommendations for are included in the gender-neutral entry. I'm trying to think. I don't believe we had separate entries for each of those. Or if we did, it said something, it might say something like, see gender neutral entry, what we call a reefer. So the extensive list is under the umbrella entry, gender neutral language. Again, for those that we have, and that's searchable. I mean, if you search, for example, manhunt online, it'll take you to that.
Yeah, the beauty of the search function on AP Stylebook Online is you don't have to necessarily know where it sits. You'll still find what you're looking for. There is a lot in the chat. There's a lot of conversation around other phrasing for homelessness, unhomed, people experiencing homelessness as opposed to the homeless, street involved, houseless. So I know you talked about how there'd been a lot of conversation about those different terms. If a local group uses one of those other kinds of words or phrases, are there guidelines on which ones you would or wouldn't use?
I think my best guidance would be the same as in any situation: avoid jargon that, well, okay, that's taking sort of a point of view that something like street involved is jargon or torturing the language, with the best intention of avoiding the problem that we're describing here, but then creating a different problem of torturing the language and coming up with terminology that regular people just don't understand. For instance, if someone said to me, she's street involved, I wouldn't have the faintest idea what you meant. And then once I figured it out, I would think you're torturing the language, honestly. So with any of those terms, I would just gauge the various ideas that you're trying to, goals that you're trying to achieve. And I think in many cases it's possible to write around it. Now, if there's a city organization, an organization called, supporting the city involved or the street involved, and that's the name of the organization, that's what it is. But I think you still need to explain it. People experiencing homelessness. There was one, I can't remember what it was, but the person who drafted this entry included one, to me, very jargony sounding term that I said, oh, come on, is anyone actually going to use that? And we agreed that no, that was not going to be in the list that we sanctioned. I wish I could remember what it was. It might have been something like people experiencing homelessness, or did I say that one was okay? This also goes back to the point that there is a whole lot of discussion and debate and back and forth that goes into all of these entries, every single one. None of this comes easily. And some of them obviously are much more complicated than others. And you know, there's always a chance, a good chance, in many cases, that we'll refine and revise as we go forward based on the feedback that we get. That's, again, one of the beauties of Stylebook Online. It drives me crazy when someone is saying, oh, I'm using my Stylebook from even 3 years ago, because so much has changed, even with individual entries, even if it's a small tweak. The Stylebook Online is just your much better option. But you know, I wouldn't be surprised on anything that I talked about today. If we make some changes, even, you know, within the week or the month, that, I mean, it's just going to happen, because we very much crowdsource and we very much listen to what we hear out there. And again, it can be just one person making an excellent point that will make some change.
Well, and you've already made the first change in the file for the 2022 Stylebook, so it's a constant evolution.
Right.
There was also some regional comment that in some parts of the country, ball jar is the dominant use over mason jar. And so I wonder if you have thoughts on if people in Indiana prefer to say ball jar, use what your audience knows.
Well, I think ball jar is one of the makers, right? So sure, I mean, we could add to it like the frosting and icing entry that says depends on where you live. I honestly, that hadn't come to my attention until just now that I think about it. But yeah, I mean, we might in the future. But we will not go back to saying under all circumstances call it a canning jar. That's not going to happen.
It looks like the collective gasp in the room is about preheat, and I would unscientifically say that there was a cheer that went up in our virtual room about the return of preheat.
That was an interesting one. And you know, there's always a fine line. Also, we don't want to undo the good work that was done before. And one thing that drives people crazy is, oh, you people, Stylebook, you're making changes to make the sake of changes. No, we're not. And there was good reason, I'm sure, 10 years ago when our food writer at the time said not to use it. And it is redundant. It's horribly redundant. But, you know, honestly, when I went to tweet that, it was some of the things, I don't agree with everything in the Stylebook. And that was one of them, even though I understood the reasons. But I'm just not going to change things that other people have done just because I personally don't like them. Although, you know, we resurface them and talk about a lot of these, like the pleated versus pled one. Preheat, you know, I was entertained by the amount of the feedback, but the arguments such as it's what it says on your oven or what it says in the cookbook, those were great, you know, and I was actually very happy because it bolstered my own thought that I always had to roll my own eyes about what was in our book. So it was actually a moment of great pleasure for me to do that. And even it violated all of my grammarian, you know, my word usage sense of being.
The Stylebook editor having to roll her own eyes at the AP Stylebook is a good point of conversation, right? It's a good reason to go back and take another look. We had a question about COVID being all caps or not.
There are a couple of reasons for that going into it, and I believe it's supported by what I've seen since then. We did have to make a decision, and we spent, again, a great deal of time talking about it with our health and science editors and some other folks. For one thing, this was the all caps version was what was used by the World Health Organization, which was the agency that named it. I mean, that was the official name with the all caps. It also is in line with some other 5-letter abbreviations such as COBRA and DARPA that are accepted as part of AP Style. And it was parallel with MERS and SARS, which are the sibling illnesses. Note, sibling illnesses, not sister illnesses or brother illnesses, but sibling illnesses, other coronavirus illnesses. So we thought from a rater's perspective, being consistent with capital COVID, capital SARS, capital MERS, since they might come up in the same story, and it was consistent with COBRA and DARPA, and it's what the official name was anyway, all of that made sense. So we went with that. since then, I'm sure a lot of people have noticed that some organizations use a capital C, lowercase, the rest of it. Some organizations use lowercase everything. But by organizations, I mean media organizations, right? As a consumer, as a regular person, when I am looking at what I see out in the world, emails that I get, or organizations writing about it, everything, this and that and their brother, by far the majority I see outside of media is with a capital COVID, all caps. So again, if I'm thinking as a regular reader, not as a highfalutin media person, and thinking about what looks right or wrong to me, if I'm used to reading guidance from government organizations and everything else with all caps, and then I see in an AP story it differently, I think AP looks wrong. I might think the all lowercase looks wrong. I might think the capital C and lowercase. I mean, there's good reasons for them choosing that style. And this is not a scientific survey, but I think broadly out in the world by people outside journalism are using the all caps, which is what's the official name to begin with. So just from making sense to the readers, I think it still works.
Okay. And just as a reminder, Paula mentioned at the top of the webinar, we have a topical guide that's extensive and has been expanded a couple of times already. That's free and open to all users. You don't have to have a subscription to Stylebook Online to use the coronavirus topical guide. The URL is kind of long and ugly, so if you just want to Google AP Stylebook coronavirus guide, it'll get you there, or feel free to shoot me an email if you want me to point you to it. I'm happy to do that. We had a question about use of the plus sign, and if it's pronounced in the name of a company as and, do you also get to use the plus sign, or is it just when you pronounce it literally as plus?
Our thinking was that if it's pronounced literally as plus. That said, you know, I might consider some examples, but we didn't want to open the door too wide. And the examples that I gave that we were considering, it was pronounced specifically as plus, not and, or anything else. So our aim was to limit it to specifically those that was pronounced plus. Now, if someone has a good argument for another case, I'd certainly want to look at it. But the thinking for now is that the actual pronunciation of plus.
Great. I think we're at about an hour, but I'm going to squeeze in one more question. We had someone asking whether we've considered to uppercase black. That's been a movement that I think, was it National Association of Black Journalists that had been advocating for that? So.
Yeah, so that's been on our radar for a couple of years. We talked about it last year. We talked about it this year. In talking with various Black people, we know that there is actually a great divide among those folks about capitalization versus lowercase. Some people say, and I'm quoting here, it's stupid to capitalize it. Other people obviously feel very strongly otherwise. NABJ itself, for a very long time, had not capitalized it. I believe that they either have now or will or might, don't quote me on that. We last talked to them a couple months ago when we were formulating all of this. But and we also obviously talked to our own AP's own Black staffers who, by and large, see no reason to uppercase it. So, you know, and as everyone knows, there's the other issues of, do you also capitalize white? What about brown? There's all sorts of things that go into that. So bottom line, yes, we discussed it at length. We will continue to do so, but for now, we're not capitalizing it.
Great. Well, that's been a jam-packed hour. Any last thoughts, Paula, before we hand it back over to Sarah and Abby?
Only that I mean it truly. I think you've seen in this that we do, it's not as if we don't think for ourselves, because there's a lot of entries that we come up with, but we get such good questions and criticisms and debates from Twitter and from emails. As I said, Neil Holdway himself triggered something. He was asking a more narrow question, but it led us to realize that, oh my goodness, somehow we don't have this we don't cover this topic at all, really. It was terrific. So if anyone out there has any, whether it's a question about a style point or a suggestion or a debate about it, please do absolutely get in touch with me at my email address there.
Thank you both so much. I am going to throw things over back to our president, Sarah Ziegler.
Get myself unmuted here and not commit the cardinal Zoom rule of talking while I'm muted. So yep, I'm Sarah Ziegler again. I'm the president of ACES. Just to wrap up this great day, thank you all so much for joining us. If you attended just one session or all of them today, we really appreciate it. We're so happy to have been able to hang out with you and learn with you about so many things today, even though we couldn't be together in Salt Lake City. Today's webinars, these 4, will be available on our website, aceseditors.org, on Monday, and they'll also be emailed to you for the ones that you registered for. If you want more of the great training you could have gotten at our national conference, our other webcasts are all free through July 31st for both members and non-members. So please check those out on our website. Again, that is aceseditors.org. All of us on the ACES board and staff really appreciate your continued support of and participation in the organization. We obviously can't do this without you, and we wouldn't want to, frankly. We can't wait to see you again at our next national conference in Atlanta on April 22nd through the 24th, 2021. Thanks so much, everybody.